Well, thank you all for coming. This is a great crowd. I wasn't sure exactly what to expect, but it's nice to see so many faces out there. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. So when I was invited to do a STAR lecture back in the summer, my initial reaction was to feel honored and excited. And then I was told what the theme is for this year's STAR lectures, courageous conversations. And I immediately did a mental backtrack. I was like, maybe I'm not the best person. To me, courage implies carrying on in the face of personal risk. And so conversations, meaningful conversations about things like race or religion or politics, those are courageous conversations. I'm just a biologist. I mean, what do I have to talk about that's courageous? And then I started thinking about how often science has been popping up in the news lately, and the context in which science has been popping up in the news lately. And from flat earthers to anti-vaxxers to our own federal government, science has been under attack from multiple sources lately. Now, some people have declared that there's a war on science. I don't believe that's true, because war suggests that there's coordination. And this hasn't been a coordinated attack on science. More, it's a series of independent ad hoc attacks on science. Regardless, there are consequences to the attacks on science. To give you one example, three of the major scientific arms of the federal government are the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. And together, these three agencies carry out and fund much of the scientific research that goes on in this country. Now, the President's 2018 budget request called for a $7.8 billion cut to those three agencies. And if that cut were to be approved by Congress, it would cripple biomedical research and disease prevention in this country. So, as much as I would love to stand up here and spend 45 minutes regaling you with the beauty and the elegance of developmental programs that take a simple single-celled zygote and sculpt it into the marvel of complexity that is the human adult, which is my field of research interest. Instead, I'm going to stand here and I'm going to tell you about science under siege. Now, this is a fairly complex topic, and it's hard to dissect in 45 minutes, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of the bases. But what I'd like to do is examine some of the causes, some of the reasons why science is under siege. I'm going to cover 6 in particular, and look at some of the possible consequences. And along the way, hopefully, throw in some lessons about how science works for you. Before we do that, though, I want to start with a little bit of background about science and scientists. And I want to do an exercise that I like to do with my intro bio class on the first day. So if you've had me for intro bio, you're not allowed to play along with this. But if you've never had me for intro bio, please feel free to chip in, because I want this to be an interactive kind of experience. So my question to you is, what is a scientist? Any thoughts? Don't be shy. Yes?
Well, scientists study the basic nature of the world and the universe to get a better grasp of reality.
That is very true. For those of you who couldn't hear, he said science studies the basic nature of the world and the universe to get a better grasp of what's going on around us, or something along those lines. I can't argue with that. It's not quite what I'm looking for, though. Other thoughts about what a scientist is? One who does research and experiments to test the falsifiable. And that gets closer to what I'm thinking of. To me, a scientist is someone who uses the scientific method. And the scientific method is a prescribed series of steps by which we investigate the world around us. and, well, world, universe, however you want to put it. And the steps in the scientific method are, first of all, you make an observation. That observation raises a question in your mind. You then seek to find a possible answer to that question. And that possible answer is known as a hypothesis. So you formulate a hypothesis. And based on that hypothesis, you can make a prediction. The prediction would be something along the lines of, if the hypothesis is correct, then if I do X, Y should happen. And that kind of prediction gives you the basis for devising an experiment to test your hypothesis. So you conduct the experiment, you get results from the experiment, and when analyzing, or from the analysis of the results, you draw conclusions. And those conclusions can be that you either accept or reject the hypothesis, and then the whole thing can go around again. So that's the scientific method. Now, you may not realize it, but I contend that everybody in this room uses the scientific method. And therefore, everybody in this room is a scientist. Some of us do it a little more intentionally than others, and as I said, you may not realize you're doing it, but I believe, well, humans are sort of naturally inquisitive creatures. And in trying to understand things, to solve problems, we just inherently use the scientific method, whether or not we're aware of it. And so I'd like to do a little demo to kind of demonstrate this for you. So here's the scenario. You have just taken the best selfie in the entire world history of selfies. And once you get it posted online, you know it is going to earn you 1 million followers on Insta Snapface or whatever. But you can't get it posted because you've got no bars on your cell phone. So, what's the first question that pops into your head? Anybody? I'm sorry? Sure. Why don't I have bars here? How can I get bars? So that's your question. So we've got an observation, no bars, a question, how do I get bars, or why don't I have bars? And that leads to maybe formulating a hypothesis. Anybody got a hypothesis? Yeah.
If I move somewhere else, maybe I'll get bars.
Maybe I'm in a dead zone, and if I stand over here, and I just messed up the video camera, I'll get more bars, and I can become an internet sensation. And so you do an experiment. Now, it's a simple experiment. It's not properly controlled, I understand, but you move around until you see some bars, and if you, over there by the piano, get those 5 bars you need, you've done the experiment, you've got the result, your conclusion is that the hypothesis was correct, your hypothesis is accepted, and now I can go on to fame and fortune, okay? So we're all doing the scientific method on a daily basis. But some of it, as I said, do it more intentionally than others and perhaps in a more sophisticated way. But we're all scientists at heart. All right, so why is science under siege? Well, as I said earlier, there's no single reason. There are a number of reasons, and I'm not going to give you an exhaustive list, but I'm going to look at 6 reasons why science is under siege, and each is linked to a particular episode in which science has come into conflict with individuals or groups. The first reason is basic human nature. People fear what they don't understand. Now, the world is getting more complicated all the time, and scientific knowledge is increasing exponentially these days. And at the same time, there's a widening gap occurring between those who are highly educated and those who are not. As a result of this, fewer people understand science and what it's all about. And so that means that more individuals distrust and fear science. Now, an example of this involves GMOs, genetically modified organisms, or frankenfoods, as some people like to call them. There is an abhorrence of genetically modified organisms in this country. But I'll tell you a little story. Apparently, in China, there is an issue with pigs dying in the cold during the winter. And that costs farmers lots of money. Now, the issue with pigs is, and the interesting thing about pigs, they are lacking a gene that every other mammal has. And this gene encodes a protein, and this protein allows fat to be burned to provide heat for the individual organism. This gene is functional in newborn infants. You know, we talk about baby fat. That's there to keep the babies warm because that fat can be burned to provide heat for the babies. It's also found in hibernating mammals. So things like bears, when they hibernate in the winter, they're burning fat to keep themselves warm. But pigs, I said they lack this gene, and that's not entirely true. They have the gene, but it doesn't work. So it's essentially a broken version of the gene in pigs, so they can't keep themselves warm this way. Well, some enterprising scientists in China used a gene editing tool called CRISPR. And they used CRISPR to fix this gene in pigs. So now there is a breed of pigs in China that can burn fat to stay warm in the winter. And it works like a charm. The added side benefit that I don't know if they anticipated this or not, but because the pigs are burning fat, they're leaner. So the pork that those pigs provide ultimately for the dinner table is a much leaner cut of pork. And that includes bacon. So of course some journalists latched onto this and came up with the phrase CRISPR bacon. Now, the sad thing about this is this breed of pig will never be allowed in the United States because people have this aversion to genetically modified foods. And there are all kinds of regulatory hurdles in place. But the thing that people don't seem to understand is that almost nothing that we eat today is not genetically modified. The corn that we eat is very, very different from the teosinte that was first domesticated 9,000 years ago in Mexico. All of our farm animals, agricultural animals, are very different from the ones that were initially domesticated. Wheat is very different from the plant that was initially domesticated. All of these organisms have undergone thousands of years of selective breeding to bring out certain traits and repress certain other traits. So we've been genetically modifying organisms for millennia. The only difference now is that we're using a scalpel instead of a sledgehammer. Second reason why science is under siege. People can get frustrated with the pace of progress of science in certain areas. For example, you hear people say, we've been doing research for decades, why is there no cure for cancer? And I understand how that can be frustrating. Well, scientists tend to be very methodical. There are always other skeptical scientists out there who need to be shown almost beyond a shadow of a doubt that what you're saying is correct and holds water. And so scientists are methodical. They need to get all of the I's crossed and T's dotted before they submit things for publication, or they may not get published. And so in some ways, science can be a slow process, and that can be frustrating. Now, this frustration, I believe, often gets exacerbated by journalists. Because journalists, for one thing, don't have a very good understanding of science and the way it's done. And they're in the business of selling newspapers or magazines or advertising on their internet blog or whatever. They need to sell. So they sensationalize the stories. So if a scientist says, well, we've made a minor breakthrough here, and we've done animal testing, we're going into phase 1 human trials, so if we're lucky, there may be a cure for disease X 15 or 20 years down the road. What the journalist hears and what shows up in print, either digitally or analog, is major breakthrough, disease X cure found. They always sensationalize it so people get higher expectations, and then when those expectations aren't met within a year or two, frustration really sets in. Reason 3. Now, despite the methodical pace of scientific research, the amount of scientific knowledge being generated these days, as I alluded to earlier, is increasing exponentially. And very often, the knowledge is increasing at a rate that is much faster than our ability to reach consensus on any ethical issues that are associated with the science. I'll give you a couple of examples. Cloning. In 1996, Dolly the sheep was born, result of cloning. Dolly was the first cloned mammal. And there was a bit of an ethical uproar because suddenly there was the possibility of cloning humans. Should we? Shouldn't we? And a lot of debate ensued, and it really hasn't been settled yet. A number of states have banned cloning of humans, and the federal government will not fund research into human cloning, but there's nothing to stop private entities from cloning humans. I find this all a little amusing because the first vertebrate clone was back in 1956. They started cloning frogs in 1956, and nobody really seemed to care much then. But that means they had 40 years to think about cloning and what the ethical issues might be, but nobody really latched onto it until we actually cloned a mammal, and then all heck broke loose. Another example involves embryonic stem cells. Now, embryonic stem cells have tremendous potential. Okay, I can see there are no developmental biologists in the audience because that was a pun and it would have killed. Embryonic stem cells are able to differentiate into any other cell type. And that makes them a remarkable tool for possibly curing or at least helping to treat a variety of different diseases. The issue with embryonic stem cells is they come from embryos. And so to get human embryonic stem cell lines, you have to sacrifice human embryos. And that raises ethical issues. Again, this is something that hasn't really been dealt with completely. In 2001, the federal government instituted a ban on federal funding of human embryonic stem cell work. But again, non-federally funded research can still go on, and the state of California offers research funding for those working on human embryonic stem cells. In the meantime, there's still lots of work going on in mouse embryonic stem cells and other types of adult stem cells that you can try to de-differentiate back into embryonic stem cells. But it's an issue that has not been resolved and probably needs to be resolved. But we seem to take a more leisurely pace at dealing with the ethical issues than we do progressing the science. And that can cause conflict. Reason number 4. Sometimes scientific concepts conflict with established belief systems. And the main example of that is evolution versus creation, as described in the Bible. Now, this has caused a lot of animosity between various groups for a significant period of time. We're looking at close to 150 years now. And it still hasn't really been resolved in a lot of ways. It's sometimes framed by people as a war between science and religion. And I don't really see it that way. Certainly some do. But I know a number of scientists of faith who embrace the concept of evolution. So I think there's middle ground in there, but we're such a polarized society that it's often hard to see that middle ground. And again, that causes conflict. Reason number 5. Sometimes the problems are self-inflicted. So scientists basically shoot themselves in the foot. I'll give you 2 examples of this. First, many scientists are uncomfortable and ineffective at explaining science to the general public. That's another reason why this is a courageous conversation, because I would probably fall into that camp. They're ineffective because most scientists are really happy talking with other scientists about the minutiae of their research. But they have trouble talking to the general public because it can be difficult to simplify some of the concepts without sounding condescending. And so that can create friction. As a result of that, and also sometimes just as a personality quirk, many scientists are uncomfortable talking to members of the general public. They're happier just being alone in the lab than they are out in the real world. Now, one of the reasons why they may have trouble relating to members of the general public is studies have shown that misconceptions among people can't be dispelled using facts or numbers or statistics. It's just completely ineffective. What works are stories and anecdotal evidence. But that's not the way scientists function. Scientists live in a data-driven world. And so they use data to make their points. And so after showing people all of the numbers and statistics and the data and presenting a rational argument based around the data, they find it really frustrating when it has no effect. And so many scientists just give up at that point. If they can't present a rational argument and have it listened to, they give up. When in reality, probably what we need to do is learn to tell stories and be more anecdotal and try to convince people or explain things in ways that people can hear and understand. The other way that scientists sometimes hurt themselves is, and I hate to admit it, but there are bad scientists out there. Now, science as a process works really well, but sometimes individuals who are involved in science develop self-interests that are contrary to science, and this usually involves money. I'll give you an example of this. The anti-vaccine movement was started because of a single publication in 1989 that linked autism to the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine. This study was published by a British group that was led by a British doctor, a gastroenterologist named Andrew Wakefield. Now, they published their results, and a lot of people got very excited about it. A lot of people tried to replicate that work, and they were unable to. Other scientists could not reproduce Wakefield's results. And so they began to look a little more carefully at Wakefield's results. And ultimately, it was found that Wakefield had falsified some of his data. And he had changed the health records of some of his subjects. Now, his research was funded by a law firm that was looking for evidence that they could use to sue pharmaceutical companies. So he had a conflict of interest. And he went into the study with the conclusion already made, and he arranged the study so that the results supported the conclusion. And that's exactly the opposite way of how science works. So it was bad science that was done. Ultimately, the paper was retracted. Wakefield was convicted of 30 counts of scientific misconduct, and he had his medical license stripped. But by then, all of the damage had been done. People had latched onto that paper and had decided that vaccines cause autism. Now, despite the fact that numerous studies have been done since then showing absolutely no link between vaccines and autism, as I said a few moments ago, it's hard to dispel misconceptions. And scientists can throw as much data at people as they want, it's not going to change their minds. So by 2008, the vaccination rates around the world had dropped substantially. And this has major consequences. To give you one example of that, Italy in 2017, this year, by April, Italy had more than 1,600 cases of measles. Measles is always the first one to show up because it is such a contagious disease. And that was more cases of measles than Italy had in all of 2016. So by the end of April, they had more cases of measles than the entire previous year. 40% of those individuals wound up in the hospital. And that's because around 40% of cases of measles develop additional complications, things like diarrhea, blindness, inflammation, and pneumonia. Not just inflammation, but inflammation of the brain and pneumonia. So serious consequences. And in a very small percentage of cases, death can result. So, whoops. It's a serious issue that these diseases are reappearing because of lowered vaccination rates. Sorry, lost my place. Now, what happened in Italy was that the vaccination rate had dropped to 83%. And in some regions, less than 70% of the people were vaccinated. And studies have shown that you need more than 95% coverage. So at least 95% of the public has to be vaccinated in order for vaccines to be truly effective in eliminating disease. And so clearly Italy was well below that, and that's why all of those problems developed. And unfortunately, there seems to be this feeling in the general public that my opinion outweighs your scientific evidence, at least among some. Reason number 6, sometimes science is just inconvenient. And that brings us to climate change. Now, I need to tell you that scientists are trained to be skeptical. You can sometimes find consensus among scientists on a topic, but you'll rarely have unanimous agreement. To give you an example from biology, in biology there are at least 4 different definitions of what a species is. And nobody can agree on which of those definitions is correct. If you put a bunch of biologists in a room and told them they had to agree on a definition of species, you'd have blood on your hands within almost no time at all. But 97% of scientists agree that a preponderance of data demonstrates convincingly that climate change is occurring and that it is due at least in part to human activity. Now, climate scientists have been attacked because of this, and that's because climate change is inconvenient for American business. To reduce carbon emissions would require businesses to make a major investment of cash, and this would hurt their bottom line. So in order to save money and protect their shareholders, people have begun to, not just begun, they've continued to deny the science and attack the scientists. Now, one thing you have to understand, and one thing these people don't understand, is that science has no agenda. If you learn nothing else from tonight's talk, this is the important one. Science has no agenda. Nobody invented climate change to take a shot at business and then started looking for evidence to support climate change. Again, that's the opposite of how science is done. Instead, someone who was studying climate observed some trends at some point, and that raised questions. And so they formulated hypotheses, designed experiments, conducted those experiments, got results, and drew conclusions from those results. Now, they may not have been the results that they wanted to see. I don't think any of us wants global warming to be occurring. But I had a postdoctoral advisor who had a saying. He used to say, "The result is the result." Now, that may seem kind of simple and silly, but what he meant was, it doesn't matter what your expected result is or what your desired result is. Whatever result you get, as long as you conducted the experiment carefully and well, that is the result, and you have to live with it. So we have to live with the results. Now, another thing about science is that it's self-regulating. If there were errors in any of the early climate change studies, then subsequent experiments would have exposed them. And because ultimately science gets things right. And I'll refer you back to the vaccine paper and autism with Andrew Wakefield. Subsequent work revealed not just errors in the science, but actual fraudulent science, but they revealed it, and science eventually got it right. When we look at climate change, the studies, the vast majority of the studies, are consistent and non-contradictory. Computer models built based on studies from up to 10 years ago have accurately predicted the present-day consequences of an increase in global temperature. So there's a lot of consistency among climate scientists and climate change research. Despite this, opponents continue to deny the science and attack the scientists. Within the last couple of weeks, the Environmental Protection Agency fired all of the scientists from its 3 scientific advisory councils and replaced them with individuals from industry. In other words, there are no longer any scientists on the scientific advisory councils. Climate scientists have been dismissed by other agencies, and they've been subjected to gag orders where they're not allowed to talk to the press and they're not allowed to talk to the public about the work that they have done. The government can't refute the science, so it appears as though it's trying to silence the scientists, to the point where publications have been deleted from government servers. This is the digital equivalent of the book burnings that they used to do in Nazi Germany. Now, this is not the first time something like this has happened. In Canada, 4 years ago, the same thing happened. The Prime Minister at the time hailed from the oil-rich province of Alberta, and climate change was a big inconvenience to him. So he muzzled all of the climate scientists, he closed 7 environmental libraries, and destroyed countless documents, including many irreplaceable historical documents. Now, You can erase findings and publications, as they did, but the truth will eventually come out, because the truth is still out there. And sometimes these things can come back to bite you in a big way. In the case in Canada, the Prime Minister was tossed out of office within a year after all of that happened. And as I said, the truth is still out there and can be rediscovered, even if you destroy all the documents. I read a great quote a week or two ago, and I forget where I saw it, which really annoys me. So I'm just paraphrasing here. But someone said that you can destroy all written works in the world, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama, and you would never be able to recreate them. So for example, if everything were destroyed, nobody could ever recreate the works of Shakespeare. However, it would be possible to recreate the works of science. Not word for word, but the concepts and ideas could be recreated because the objective truth is still out there, to be rediscovered by other future scientists. So those are 6 reasons why science comes into conflict with individuals and groups. Now, why is this important? Why am I talking about this? Why should we care if a bunch of science nerds get marginalized by society? Well, setting aside for a moment the fact that the last time this happened, it led to a historic period known as the Dark Ages, I'll give you 2 examples of why science is important in society. First of all, one thing that originally made this country great was the knack for and the focus on science and technological innovation. I could stand here for a long time and list off innovations that helped to make this country great and make our lives better. But in the 20th century alone, just looking at advances in medical science, it had a massive impact on health and society, not only in this country, but around the world. Now, other countries are surpassing the United States in terms of their scientific progress, and if this continues, then the US will lose its global standing as a leader in science and innovation. Secondly, unless there is a huge shift in human reproductive, I don't want to say strategy, but I'm having trouble coming up with a better word, tendencies, science will be needed to try and stave off a major catastrophe within your lifetime. This is a lesson from biology. Now, in biology, we have a concept known as carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the number of individuals in a population that the ecosystem can support without degrading the environment. Now, if a population exceeds its carrying capacity, there are factors that come into play. And these are known as density-dependent population regulating factors. It's a wonderful term, it just rolls off the tongue. And these are things like the availability of food, or lack thereof, competition for other limited resources, accumulation of waste, and the prevalence of disease. So as a population grows and gets close to its carrying capacity, these density-dependent population regulating factors kick in. They cause an increase in the death rate, and that either stabilizes the population or causes it to decline. If a population exceeds its carrying capacity by quite a bit, the decline can be catastrophic and can lead possibly to extinction of the species, or at least extinction of that population. So what is the carrying capacity for humans? Fact is, we don't really know. It's been a moving target throughout history. Every time a new innovation occurred that offset one of those density-dependent population regulating factors, the carrying capacity went up. So, better sanitation, carrying capacity goes up. Better medical treatment, carrying capacity goes up. And so our carrying capacity has been going up throughout human history, to the point where we don't really know where it is. Now, unfortunately, since the Industrial Revolution, so the past 200 years or so, human population growth has exploded to the point where it's going faster than ever in human history. Our current population is 7.6 billion, and within 40 years, it's going to hit 10 billion. So by the time all of you are my age, we are going to add another third to our population. Now, at some point, especially if innovation stalls, we're going to hit our carrying capacity. And when that happens, the density-dependent population regulating factors are going to kick in. And that's going to spell bad news for the human race. Now, maybe they already have kicked in. It's hard to say, but there is some evidence out there. Pollution is becoming a major issue in certain places like Beijing and Mumbai. Waste is increasing all the time to the point where some cities don't know what to do with all their trash. And then there's disease. Have you guys noticed that every few years these days, there's a new killer disease that pops up out of nowhere? Now, we could go all the way back to the onset of AIDS in the early 1980s. But looking just at the last few years, there have been outbreaks of SARS, avian flu, and Ebola that have been major, major issues. And this is because, or potentially because, with increased population numbers and increased population density, it makes the evolution of new diseases more likely, and it makes the transmission of those diseases much easier. And all of this is happening at a time when, as I mentioned before, vaccination rates are falling, and we're about to run out of antibiotics because of the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Now, these outbreaks that we've had in the past few years, with those outbreaks, catastrophes were prevented by a strong response from the medical and scientific communities. But if we turn our backs on science, that response may not be coming sometime in the future, and we could face catastrophic consequences. Now, just to underscore that I'm not making all of this up, just yesterday, 15,000 scientists signed a letter stating that the human race is facing, and I quote, the existential threat of runaway consumption of resources by a rapidly growing population. If the world doesn't act soon, there will be catastrophic biodiversity loss and untold human misery. That's a nice optimistic note to end on, isn't it? So what can we do? Well, I have a couple of suggestions. Two simple things that I think each and every one of you can do to help with the situation. First of all, keep practicing the scientific method. Be a little more aware when you use it, and that way you'll get better at using it and perhaps become a little more aware and a little more adept at science in general. Secondly, and I think this is more important, be skeptical. Don't accept any assertion from anyone without evidence. We hear a lot today, many people believe, ... and that's supposed to be good enough. Don't let it be good enough. When someone says that, ask who believes. Demand evidence from those people. If we can do that, then I think we can defend and maintain the concept of objective truth, which is ultimately what the field of science is all about finding. Thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take any questions that anyone might have. I don't know if someone's going to moderate or if just want me to do it. Okay. Questions from anyone? Would you rather I just tap dance for you? You don't want that, trust me. Yes? Oh, gosh. Now I'm going to have to go back to my notes. Here we go. Human nature, the slow pace of science, in other words, frustration at not finding the cure for cancer, how despite that, science develops faster than ethics, science conflicts with pre-existing belief systems, scientists can shoot themselves in the foot, and sometimes science is inconvenient. Did you get that? Okay. Other questions? Yes?
What exactly are your thoughts on the state of science education at the moment? Since I have a feeling that possibly could be a factor.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think science education has really lagged in this country, particularly at the primary and not so much secondary, but really at the primary level. Part of that is not really having a plan for science education, although that's changing now. And I think part of it is simply that educators are not valued as professionals in this country the way they are in other countries. So you don't necessarily get the best scientific minds teaching science to kids at earlier grades. And I think that's unfortunate. Yes?
You spoke about antibiotic-resistant bacteria and the threat that will pose to future generations. What steps can the global community take to kind of circumvent that?
Probably first and foremost, don't let your doctor prescribe antibiotics to you unless you really need them. I'll tell you an experience from my own life. When I was actually probably about your age, when I was in college, I developed pneumonia. And I went to the doctor and, underwent a battery of tests. And the doctor said, "You've got viral pneumonia. I'm going to prescribe you this antibiotic." Now, for those of you who don't know, antibiotics do not work on viruses. They only work on bacteria. And I knew enough, even as, a university sophomore, to know that. And I said to him, "Why are you giving me antibiotics if it's viral pneumonia?" And he said, "Just in case." Okay. Now, the problem with that is if you prescribe antibiotics when they're not needed, you may knock down any bacteria that are around that are susceptible to the antibiotic. But any bacteria that have even the tiniest bit of resistance, they're going to be selected for. And they're going to survive that selection and grow and become a bigger proportion of the population and more likely to pass their genes on to future generations of bacteria. So over time, we get antibiotic-resistant bacteria showing up. So, that would be a big one. The other one is all of the antibiotics that we pump into our farm animals, into chickens and cattle. And, that's on the decline, thankfully, once people smartened up. But that's been a big issue as well. And then we, of course, eat the products and start developing antibiotic-resistant strains in us as well. I guess the other thing is just hope that pharmaceutical companies come up with new ideas. They're combing the earth trying to find new sources of treatments, new antibiotics, but remains to be seen. Actually, the species I do my research on, Xenopus laevis, is the African clawed frog. And the slime on the skin of these frogs is a source of natural antibiotics. And there are companies that are trying to mine these frogs to get new antibiotics for use. So if your doctor ever wants to prescribe you frog slime, go for it. Other questions? Yes?
Why haven't they made lab reports more simple for the public to read for awareness?
Boy, that's It's a good question. It's one I don't know. Well, I can give you a couple of answers. One, there's a certain segment of the scientific community that like to use a lot of big words to impress their friends. But sometimes those big words are necessary. There's a lot of jargon in these papers. And there doesn't necessarily have to be, but publication costs can be quite prohibitive. And so if you're trying to keep your paper to a certain minimal or a short length, because you can't afford to pay for much more, and you can use one big word instead of 12 little ones, sometimes you do it just to keep things concise. So that's probably the biggest reason. Maybe it would be worthwhile translating some of these papers for the general public. Maybe somebody needs to start doing that. Someone who isn't a journalist, someone with a science background. That's not a bad idea. Maybe I'll start that company. Yeah.
You mentioned that scientific research sometimes is burdened by some sort of moral implications of the field. For example, in the case of cloning. And you also mentioned that it cannot advance because those moral conversations have not been settled. How do you see, for example, in the case of cloning or research on stem cells, how do you see those conversations coming into terms?
Another very good question. So if you didn't hear it, in the case of moral implications, how do I see those conversations happening so that the research isn't stalled or held up in some way? There are a couple of answers to that. And I guess I probably should have mentioned this. Most scientists don't really anticipate the ethical issues when they're doing it because it's not part of the equation. The cloning of Dolly the sheep was done as a demonstration of a principle of developmental biology that had never been demonstrated in mammals before. So it was to show a developmental principle. It was done in good faith science. It wasn't, hey, let's clone a sheep. Once that sheep was cloned, then the genie was out of the bottle and they were like, we didn't realize what kind of a firestorm we were going to cause. So I guess to answer your question, we need to have better communication between scientists and the people who have these ethical discussions, bioethicists and whatever else. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't always stall. In the case of cloning, yeah, there's essentially a moratorium on human cloning. I don't know if that's really a big deal. My attitude about cloning was it should only be done if there's a real scientific purpose for it. There are some potential treatments or some potential avenues of treatment that may come out of cloning, but they're not major ones. So the main thing that cloning is being used for right now is, to make copies of your puppy or kitty when they die and you miss them. That's not a good use of the science as far as I'm concerned, but that's just my opinion. In the case of stem cells, a really interesting thing happened where the federal government refused to fund any work on human stem cells. Now, as I said, California will fund it, so a lot of stem cell scientists moved to California. But in the rest of the country and in other parts of the world where they also banned work on human embryonic stem cells, work intensified on taking adult stem cells. And we all have adult stem cells in us right now. They can usually just differentiate into one kind of cell. So for example, my epidermis here. Underneath the outer layer of cells, there is a stem cell line that replaces all of the epidermal cells that I kill off every time I scratch myself. Now, people have taken those adult stem cell lines, and they've done some remarkable research de-differentiating those cells and turning them into cells with increased potential to differentiate into other cell types. So I guess part of my answer, at least, would be that most scientists ultimately, someone clever enough will come along who can find another route, another way of doing it that gets around any of the ethical issues. Yes?
You mentioned how population needs to be controlled because right now it's kind of ballooning out of control. Do you agree that if resources were more like evenly distributed, that there would be sufficient resources, or at least to a greater degree than they are now?
Another excellent question. I almost feel fraudulent up here because half these questions are coming from my honors intro bio class, and it almost makes me think I feel like I planted them in the audience. So the question was, with the ballooning population, could things be ameliorated, if I can put words in your mouth, by more equitably distributing resources around the world? And this is something we're going to cover in Bio 110 later this semester. There is something known as an ecological footprint, and it's the impact that each person has on the planet. Are you proud of me, Jamin? I learned all of this from watching him for 16 years. And this ecological footprint, it's a measure of how much resources each person uses. It's measured in hectares. And they've worked out the number of hectares each person would be limited to in order to have some hope of at least slowing the environmental damage and the ecological breakdown that human population growth is having on the planet. And that average is somewhere, what is it, about 3 times less than what the typical American has? Is that 5 times? Yeah, okay, so our ecological footprint in the United States is 5 times what the average should be. So I guess I would say we have some difficult decisions to make about what kind of lifestyle we want to live if we want to try and protect and be good stewards for the planet. Yes?
How do you feel about science getting more than politics? A lot of politicians aren't held to.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
So you mentioned that a huge problem is that science isn't really conveyed adequately to the public, but I was also wondering how you felt about the fact that many politicians are making scientific decisions, so based on science, have very little to no scientific background and how that might be, rectified, or if you feel that it's going in one way or another, because just watching some candidates for certain positions be interviewed in the last week, you can see that they have no clue what's going on, but that really seems to be a non-issue, even though these people are being put in charge of making decisions that are 100% to do with scientific research they are completely unfamiliar with.
Yeah, as far as non-scientists making or decisions regarding science being made by non-scientists, I'm against it.
I guess that politics is bringing worse in that direction, or how can we?
It seems to be getting worse lately. I'm not sure how we can address that. I guess we need more scientists in politics. But that's a bit of a tough road to hoe as well. Last year in April, no, this year in April, 2017, we had the March for Science. And, scientists in Washington and around the world, including here in Ypsilanti, went on a march to support science. And we were trying to drum up support for that. And I had a number of scientific colleagues who were not interested in participating because they said science shouldn't be political. And I agree, science shouldn't be political, but it already is. And we just need to make sure that the politics of science is handled by people who are aware of how science works. How to do that, I don't really know. Yes?
So you mentioned that climate change is at least partially responsible for human actions. How much of that would you say is actually due to human actions?
Well, I'm not a climate scientist, so I do not feel qualified to answer that question. I'm sorry. Yes?
So I'm a biochemist major, so I'm a science person. What could people who are science people do to help the general population understand science better? So science is under siege by the general population. I'm not talking politics, I'm just talking about the average Joe who didn't think to be science classes.
I guess be willing to talk to people. Just talk, spread the word. I said it's difficult sometimes for scientists to talk to the general public. And I've certainly had my issues, but at the same time, I've had some really good conversations with people when I can take one aspect of what I do that I can describe to someone and really get them to see and understand. And usually it's something fairly straightforward. One that I always enjoy talking about is one of the basic questions of developmental biology. And it's the one I mentioned kind of at the beginning of the talk, how we all start off as a single-celled zygote. It's one cell, not particularly specialized in any way. And that one cell gives rise to something like this. Well, maybe I'm not the best example, but something like me, composed of trillions and trillions of cells and hundreds of different cell types. And so how does that one cell produce hundreds of different types of cells, each of which is very highly specialized in terms of its structure and in terms of its function? To me, that's a fascinating question. And when I talk to people, I can get them to see that fascination. And I think the passion really helps too. If you can be passionate about what you're doing and find some basic question that you're interested in and relate your interest and your passion for that to people in the public, that goes a long way. Yes?
So, as kind of things just seem to be worse and worse as far as like administration and their stance on climate change and their understanding of climate change, do you think that like people are going to start realizing, like is this a turning point where people will start realizing how bad this is? Or like, do we have a lot to do?
I hope so. I hope they realize before we hit the turning point, because when we hit the turning point, there may not be turning back. And things may collapse in a hurry at that point. That's the way these sort of network systems seem to go. I tend, despite the way I talk during part of my talk, I tend to be an optimist about human nature. And I hope that people will see the light at some point. Whether they do, I'm not sure. The thing that gets lost in all of this, and this is kind of where some of my hope comes in with regard to climate change. People are fighting it because it's going to cost a lot of money. But at the same time, what's lost is there are new companies and new jobs springing up, developing the technologies to offset those carbon emissions. So it's actually potentially helping the economy. And if people could realize that and really focus on that, maybe we could get it to balance out. Yes?
So, in talking with being an optimist and hoping that things can turn around with the return, do you believe we have not passed that point of the return yet and that things can be turned around at this point?
Again, I'm not personally a climate scientist, but from what I've read, it seems like there is still time to turn it around. However, it's a big ship, and it's going to take a while to turn it around. So hopefully we can do it in time. That's all I can say. Yes?
As a scientist, how do you address issues in ethics versus the interest of science?
By nature, I'm a utilitarian. So I look at the big picture, and not just my self-interest, but the interests of all parties involved. And so, like I said, I work on amphibians. Dirty secret, I have cloned frogs in the past. But like I said, looking at cloning in the bigger picture, I don't see doing it unless there is a real point to it, a real purpose, a meaningful purpose. So you kind of take all sides of the argument, you weigh them against each other, and then decide on a course of action. That's my philosophy. Yes?
Do you feel that the fact that college is such a for-profit business in our country in particular, that's part of the reason we're so fall behind in our country?
I'm sorry, you're sitting right in a perfect echo chamber there.
So, do you feel at all that the fact that universities in the United States in particular are more for-profit businesses than they are in other countries, also stifling our ability to keep pace with other countries' scientific development, and also, kind of cascade the effect that leads to less educated people making decisions, so kind of the trickle down from this knowledge being less available in our country as it is in others?
Yeah, boy, you really want to get me going political, don't you?
You do have tenure.
For now. I can't disagree with anything you've said. I think for-profit colleges are a dangerous trend in this country. I think that the nonprofit model has served us extremely well. I think the public university model has served us extremely well, at least until the state government started cutting off the funds. Now things are starting to choke a little, but we're still doing the best we can. I think we need to find a way, and I don't have an answer for this, but need to find a way to educate more people. A lot of people get lost in the system, don't ever make it, even through primary and secondary school. And I don't want to cast aspersions on our public schools, but education needs to be better. That's all I can say. We can't afford to lose individuals the way we do now. I realize that's kind of a vague statement, but somebody was pointing. Oh, there you are.
This country has a special or an especially bad problem with understanding certain scientific concepts or accepting them for the matter, like as opposed to like certain Western European countries.
Yeah, well, evolution immediately comes to mind. This is pretty much the only country where there is a large contingent of people who are opposed to the idea of evolution. I don't really know why that is, but it is what it is. Although it's starting to spread into Canada a bit now. Yes?
More of a comment, but I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that scientists need to be better at storytelling, because in fact, in one class here recently saw a paper by Tyrone Hayes, and a lot of his explanations of his studies are more story than like giving data points, and I found it really interesting how much more he was received by the public eye than someone giving out data points.
And if you noticed, I tried to work in a couple of stories tonight. Yes?
So you mentioned how we are wasteful and producing pollutants, but I think that the scientific community is largely adding to that in a lot of ways. And I was wondering if you had any input on how we could reduce that, because I know that in labs and stuff there's a lot of ways.
How so?
Like when all the supplies
Although, I'm sorry, I missed that. Yeah, I don't know that there's any more waste in science labs than there is in the typical household. I know a lot of companies have developed green initiatives to reduce waste. And I guess my reaction would be the number of scientists and labs in this country compared to the number of businesses and households is minuscule. So the amount that science contributes to the problem of waste is pretty tiny. I mean, we should get better. We should do the best we can at minimizing waste. But I don't think we're huge contributors to the problem, no more so than anybody else. Yes?
I've been reading a lot lately, not like, this isn't like the most on topic of all the questions, but I'm not on topic. Anyway, I've been reading a lot lately about like pop science and sensationalist articles that gain a lot of like press and Facebook shares. What are your thoughts on how that contributes to the view of science and the community as a whole?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Because, you know, you post something on Facebook, it gets shared a few million times, and before you know it, that's what everybody believes, whether or not it's true. I think that's been a big problem for science. I hadn't really considered that, but I think you're absolutely right. I don't know how to deal with it except start posting back. But you know, it's one of those things. Scientists, the stuff they post is going to be data driven, which, as I talked about, isn't that persuasive.
But you charged us at the end with the solution.
Be skeptical.
More skeptical.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I would say. Be more skeptical about what you read on social media. Don't take anything at face value, not even from me. Yes? I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Not much of a science major or anything, but I remember some articles I was reading where it was potentially most of the oil reserves that we have right now will be going down in the next 40 or 50 some years. And I just kind of wanted to see, what do you think we should do? And probably not interesting, because obviously it's not a easy subject to go on, but I just wanted to hear.
Yeah. So I hail from the oil-rich province of Alberta. But that doesn't really influence my opinion, I guess. I've seen the negatives. We're going to run out of oil eventually. My attitude is, let's start investing in alternatives now while we still have time to get them in place, before we run out of oil and then have to scramble. Not to mention that, you know, solar and other forms of energy are much cleaner. You know, it's going to get to a point. In Alberta, they have the oil sands, which there's supposed to be a huge amount of oil trapped in there, but the cost, and not just the monetary cost, but the cost to the environment of extracting that oil from the oil sands, to me is too great. And we should just leave it there and invest in other cleaner forms of energy. Personal opinion. Other questions? Oh, yes.
Sort of more of a comment, but I think it's interesting because I agree with you that science doesn't have a direct agenda because it's a method to, but I think that some of the things that we uncover are some of the discoveries we make, like when someone discovered, oh, the climate is changing, have ethical things behind them, and you mentioned like ethical things are some of the reasons why science is held back. But I almost think that in discovery
Yeah, you make a very good point, and I probably should have differentiated between science and scientists. Science has no agenda. Once discoveries are made, based on those, sometimes the scientists will develop an agenda. Or other people may develop an agenda based on the science. So, you know, science itself, like I said, is self-regulating. It doesn't really, it is what it is. It's where people get involved that we start getting into some of these moral and ethical quandaries. In terms of what we should do about it, I don't know. I suppose that's up to the individual. If you see something or discover something that could benefit mankind, absolutely, you know, go for it. But if it's going to take you into conflict, you know, weigh the good versus the bad. And it really depends on the specific situation, I think.
So in an example of climate change, there's been studies upon studies saying that the brunt of the effect is bared by people in third world countries, people in undeveloped nations.
Yes.
And there was, I wish I remembered the article, and also read it annoyingly well, where one of the ministers of South African country said the climate action agreement in the 1990s, where a lot of the developed nations signed on to it, saying this is the thing that we will do something about because it's affecting all of us and it's affecting me more. And so many of the countries have then sort of bailed on their commitments, and it's almost condemning those countries who now want an opportunity to develop in the same way that we have.
Right.
By continuing to develop in our same way. And so that I went off on a tangent, I apologize. But it's ethical to me to say some of the things we do on a daily basis and that we know we're doing and that we know are having harmful effects on the earth are more harmful to people elsewhere. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we're doing things every day and trying to find new ways to not harm them as much.
Yeah, so you're right that we've reaped the benefits of our industrial development that has led or at least contributed to climate change. And some of these developing countries haven't yet had that opportunity, and now they are being constrained in their ability to do so. So they're being prevented from doing what we've already done and are now telling them they can't do. Yeah, in many ways that's unfair. That's not for me to try and figure out. But I think you make a good point that each of us needs to make decisions based on our conscience about how we're going to live our life, what kind of resource use we are going to tolerate in ourselves. You know, what kind of ecological footprint we are willing to have. And if everybody decides based on their conscience, that's the sort of thing that can have real power. If everybody makes a little concession, it can have a huge impact globally. We just have to make that commitment. Yes?
Do you think scientists need to do a better job of making their inventions or their work accessible to all populations, or making sure their work isn't politicized, or do you think that's entirely on people who politicize these, or people who limit the resources and access to resources?
Yes. No, sorry, I'm being facetious. Again, an excellent question. So there are issues with some pharmaceutical companies that develop drugs and charge prices that really mean only developed nations can afford, and the developing nations are left out. And what they get instead are, almost cast-offs, things that won't get FDA approval in this country, but okay, we'll sell them to a third world country and make our profits there. I think there should be more equitable distribution. I don't know how that's going to happen. It's like I said, things start to get sticky when money gets involved. It always does. On the one hand, I can understand that these pharmaceutical companies are pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into research and development, and they need to make that money back. But at the same time, I think they have a moral obligation to the world if they develop something that could help people, to use those things to help people. I don't know how you balance that. Another one, Monsanto is a company that I don't have a lot of respect for. They produce, pesticides and whatnot, but my issue with them is they have developed genetically engineered crop seeds that may be drought resistant or something like that, or pest resistant or whatever. Pesticide resistance is a big, not pesticide, yeah, pesticide resistance, herbicide resistant, so that you can grow your corn crop, and if weeds come in, you just dump Roundup death kill on it, get rid of the weeds, and your corn doesn't die because it's genetically modified. Now that's fine, but their business model means that those farmers, in past practice, farmers would grow corn, they would sell most of it and keep some of it for seed to plant next year, and so the crops renew every year. Well, Monsanto has inserted other genes into these things so that they can't be kept as seed. You have to go back to Monsanto and buy it every year. So they're basically, sucking more money out of the wallets of the farmers. I don't think that's right. But again, they've invested money in developing these things, so I'm not sure where you draw the line. But they're sticky issues, no question. And a hush descended. All right, well, thank you all for coming.